Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to present this paper and also for the generous funding from the Keynes Fund. So yes, this paper is called Sorting Robots, How Automation Shapes the Allocation of Workers Across Firms. And let me begin with some very descriptive introduction about, on the left-hand side, the evolution of the number of robots per 1,000 workers in European countries that is steadily increasing, especially in Germany and similarly in Italy until at least the Great Recession, and a bit less in other European countries. And why I'm reporting here Germany, Italy as separate countries with respect to the rest, or because this paper will focus on Italy. So Italy is the focus of my project, and Germany is here because Germany is the biggest robot adopter in the European Union. So the country where there is the higher presence of automation across all European countries. And on the right-hand side, I show you a sort of a specular graph that reports the share of employment in manufacturing that is steadily declining across different countries, a bit less in Germany and Italy with respect to the other countries. Germany and Italy have also a higher share, a higher level in the share of employment in manufacturing because they are the two largest manufacturing weights in the European Union. But basically, I start by observing that there seems to be a sort of negative correlation between robot presence over time and the share of employment in manufacturing, basically suggesting that there could be an effect of higher automation on how work is organized in different countries. So in this paper, what I do, I analyze the effects of automation on the labor market, and I will focus specifically in manufacturing, mainly because of data limitation, because robot data are available across sectors within manufacturing, but are let's say, not very present for sectors other than manufacturing. And I will do that from three angles, although I will mainly present only the first angle today because of time. So first, I will basically look at the employment biographies of 140,000 workers that are exposed to different degrees of robot penetration over time. So the first question that I will ask is whether workers were displaced because of robots, and if yes, how did they adjust? So what their employment looks like after their displacement. Then the second part that is in this gray color is in gray because it's I'm not going to cover this part of the paper today, but basically I try to do the same analysis also on firms, trying to see what happens at firms in sectors that have a higher automation exposure and how firms are affected in their financial conditions and also how they change their labor composition. Because probably the most important and more original question of this project is how the allocation of workers across different firms and the sorting of workers and firms within sectors changes in response to higher automation exposure, which is the third part of the paper, where I basically try to answer the question whether better workers go to better firms following higher automation exposure. And in this case, I use an empirical strategy that is an event study around automation spikes, that is episodes of big increases in automation in a given sector with respect to other sectors. I will cover mostly the first part of the paper, and I will just briefly touch towards the end of the presentation the third part of the paper, just showing you some results. So the contribution is twofold. So first, on the literature on the effects of automation on the labor market and on employment and wages in general. So I'll try to provide some additional evidence on a country Italy, that has some particular labor market institutions in light of the fact that usually all these papers that try to estimate the impact of automation on the labor market usually find contrasting evidence, which also depends on the types of labor market institutions that are present in a given country. So, for example, usually the studies in the US labor market that is much more flexible than European labor market and with lower levels of employment protection legislation find negative effects of automation on employment and wages, whereas the studies in Europe usually find either null effects of automation or in some cases even positive effects of automation. And second, I contribute a little bit on the literature on skill bias technological change, because, and here you have to trust me because I'm not showing this bit of results today. I show how different firm types change the demand for different worker types. And I also show what are the aggregate effects on labor market sorting across sectors. So I briefly introduce the data that I'm going to use to answer these questions. So I use a matched employer-employee dataset on private sector workers in Italy from social security records. I basically have a random sample of workers that cover about 7% of the population of private sector workers in Italy over the period 1985-2018. So I follow the employment history of these workers throughout this period. I also have some firm level information and balance sheet data for firms. And crucially, and this is where the Keynes fund was really helpful, I bought data from the Industrial Federation of Robotics on the number of industrial robots by sector over the period 1993-2018. So in order to have information on the number of robots deployed in two-digit sectors, mostly two-digit sectors. I also add data on trade volumes with China and Eastern Europe and data on ICT capital across sectors in order to control for possible confounding forces that could impact employment and wages besides robots. So I start by showing you the worker level adjustment. So the question that I'm trying to answer here is how strongly an individual worker is affected by automation. So what I do, I select the cohort of employees present in my matched employer-employee data set in 1994, and I follow their careers over time. And I try to relate their career, their labor market career, on their exposure to robots in a given sector. So I will run this regression where the dependent variable is an outcome, which is going to be either earnings, days worked, the number of labor market transitions that you have over the whole period, 1994-2008. So we'll use cumulated outcomes over this whole period. For worker I employed in sector J in 1994, and I will regress this outcome on this main explanatory variable, that is the change in the number of robots per worker in sector J between 2018 and 1994. So I normalize this change with respect to the number of workers present in the sector in 1991 in order to have, let's say, a predetermined employment size of the sector. And then I also add a bunch of other controls, observable characteristics of workers, and also characteristics of sectors. As I was mentioning before, the, let's say, crucial controls that I include in this Z variable are the change in exposure to trade, in import exposure from China and Eastern Europe, which are shown to have an effect on employment and wages as well, and in ICT capital, in order to, let's say, keep fixed these other these other factors that could affect our results. Now, of course, even after controlling for this rich set of observables, one could still argue that the relationship between employment and wages and robot exposure is endogenous. So that's why I follow the literature and basically use an IV strategy in order to instrument the change in robot exposure in Italy with the change in robot exposure in other 7 European countries, which are basically those that I showed at the beginning. So it's going to be Germany and United Kingdom, France, Spain, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Results. So I basically run these regressions for 4 different outcomes: cumulative annual earnings between 1994 and 2018, the cumulative number of days worked over the same period, the average daily wage, which is simply the ratio of the first and the second column, and the cumulative number of labor market transitions. So how many times you change job during this period of time. Basically, what we see from these basic results is that the impact of robots in the Italian context and for Italian workers is not negative at all. So it is null or even positive if we look at the number of days worked. So workers employed in sectors that are more exposed to automation increase the number of days that they work over their labor market careers. Now, this coefficient here means that one additional robot per worker increases the number of days worked by 5.6. Or if you want, we can compare a worker that is at the 75th percentile of the automation exposure distribution with one that is at the 25th percentile. And this coefficient translates in approximately 4 additional months of work. So not such a big effect. So something that is closer to a null effect rather than a positive effect, but nonetheless statistically significant. And we also find that there is no effect on cumulative earnings or on the average daily wage, but we also find that there is a higher retention of workers in these sectors, meaning that they tend to move less frequently to other sectors if they are employed in more automated industries. So this is the, let's say, the treatment period between 1994 and 2018. Here I show also sort of placebo on the pre-period, so before the change in automation exposure that I am focusing on. So here, ideally, I would like to see no statistically significant effect. I find some sort of pre-trends in the number of days worked. So basically in sectors that are more exposed to automation, workers are basically more attached to the labor market rather than in sectors that are less exposed to automation. But if we look at the dynamic effects, here you really see that this pre-trend is present, but is, let's say, not increasing as it is in the treatment period, so between 1994 and 2018. And the same holds true for the cumulative number of transitions as well. Now, these results show, let's say, that the impact of robots on workers is null or even positive, but one can expect to find some heterogeneous effects for different types of workers, and also one can expect to find different effects for incumbent workers and for workers moving to other employers. And this is basically probably the most important results for this part of the paper. So here what I do, I decompose the results that I showed you in the previous slide for the aggregate effect of automation on workers into different pieces that basically look at employers that in column 2 remain in the same firm and in the same two-digit industry throughout their whole career between 1994 until when they retire or they exit the labor market. And basically what we see is that for these workers, so for incumbent workers, the effects of a higher automation exposure are positive and statistically significant. So they earn more and they work more days. Instead, the effects turn to be negative for workers that are displaced to other firms. So here you see that there are negative effects, although significant only for the cumulative number of days worked. For workers that change firm with respect to their original firm in 1994. Effects are negative as well, but not statistically significant for workers changing firm and changing also industry. And they are strongly negative and statistically significant for workers that change firm, change two-digit industry, and also move outside of manufacturing. So signaling basically that the effects of automation on workers are highly heterogeneous, and in particular highly heterogeneous between workers that stay at their original employer and workers that move to other employers, and in particular for workers moving to other employers outside of manufacturing. And second, there are also heterogeneous effects depending on the skills of workers, as we can imagine that more skilled workers are or should be more complementary to automation, so they could also be more likely to benefit more from automation adoption rather than less skilled workers, and the effects are also heterogeneous according to the occupation. So these two graphs basically are sort of two faces of the same medal. So here I'm basically showing heterogeneous effects according to worker skills, where I measure worker skills by a worker fixed effect computed from an AKM regression, so a regression of wages on observable worker characteristics, worker fixed effects, and firm fixed effects. So the worker fixed effect here can be interpreted as a sort of portable component of earnings, which should measure a combination of your own ability skill level and education level, since I do not have education in my data. So basically what this graph is showing you is that the effects are highly positive for workers in the top tier tercile of the skill distribution measured by the worker fixed effects, and that the effects are positive independently of the skill level for workers remaining in the same firm where they are employed at the beginning of the period, and that the losses for workers displaced to other firms are present only for workers with low or middle skill level. Instead, more skilled workers, let's say, are safe in terms of earnings losses, and they actually gain something even if they are displaced. Similar conclusion we reach if we look at occupation. So if we believe that there is, let's say, a sort of mapping between skills and tasks, then we can interpret as blue collar those workers that perform less skilled tasks or let's say more routine tasks, and white collar workers as those that are more skilled in the labor market, and we reach similar conclusions with white collar workers gaining more than blue collar workers in terms of cumulative earnings. So I'm close to completion, so I'm just showing you basically a hint of the third part of the paper where I examine labor market sorting. So with the idea being that to answer the question of whether following automation adoption, what happens to sorting in the labor market. So how mobility of workers of different skill levels changes across firms of different productivity levels. So basically here I'm showing you the results without giving any explanation about the empirical strategy, but in a nutshell, what I do, I basically look at sectors that experience a big increase in automation in a given year relative to other sectors. So I call these events automation spikes. And what I look at how labor market sorting changes in these sectors following these automation spikes. And basically, this is a perfect setting for an event study type analysis. So basically here, these coefficients show how labor market sorting changes following the automation spike in a given sector. And actually what I find that the labor market sorting declines in sectors following the automation spikes, either declines or after some time becomes not statistically significant. So basically in the last part of the paper, what I try to show is that there is no increase in labor market sorting following automation adoption, and therefore in sectors that experience higher automation adoption, there shouldn't be big increases in wage inequality. However, this analysis must be complemented with what I show in the first part of the paper, and especially for workers that are displaced to other sectors relative to those where they start with. So if we take everything together, basically the conclusion is that automation in Italy seems to have a positive effect for workers that remain at their original employer with little effects on wage inequality, but big negative effects for workers displaced to other sectors.